Okay. So it didn't get too far before remembering to start recording. So some of the quick housekeeping things for us to cover are introductions, which we've already done, and then just on Zoom, know that if like my video thumbnail is showing in the corner like it is now, if it's blocking something, you should be able to hit that little small line to minimize it, and that will remove the video and remove obstructions from the screen. Otherwise, this is, I think each of you might have heard me say this already, that this is a fun chance to kind of be conversational in these workshops too. So please feel free to, raise your hand or come off of mute and ask me any questions as I move through tonight's workshop. I'm doing my best to keep an eye on chat, but with some tech stuff, I am a little concerned I might miss them. One other tech note that has been happening with my laptop is I'm basically experiencing these like 30-second pauses where I am lagged out and I can't access Zoom. My computer is just turning itself to sleep, like as if you were inactive. And so I just have to like tap and log back in. So if I get frozen, that's most likely the reason, and I will be back as soon as possible. And I hope it doesn't happen. And then of course, a thank you to Steve. So one of our board members, Steve Berliner, is a really wonderful wildlife photographer and supplied a lot of the photos and videos that we will be seeing today. So today we're going to talk about who are the wildlife that live here and what do they need, especially since we're in urban areas. We'll spend a little bit of time focusing in on a small selection of some of the species in the watershed that are iconic, but also impactful, I would say, and might have a bigger ripple effect throughout our ecosystems. And then we're going to talk about how we can help wildlife, how we can support wildlife in the watersheds. And we're going to look at that through what we can do individually, through work that the Watershed Council does, and through work that really happens at larger scale collaboration. There's also a bit of interactivity in this one. I have a background in environmental ed, so when I talk to you guys like your fourth graders, it's a compliment because we can learn at any age. And so in the wildlife one, we have just a couple options for people to shout out what critter we think we are seeing. So any guesses on this one?
Beaver.
Yep, you got it. The way to tell nutria versus beaver apart by their faces is nutria have white whiskers that are pretty boldly visible, whereas beavers don't really have white standout whiskers. Of course, if you can see their tails, that's much more of an easy giveaway, since nutria have just that typical rodent rat tail. What about this one? Any guesses what kind of bird?
Cool bird.
Gray heron?
Great blue heron.
Yep, a great blue heron, exactly. How about this one? Sometimes we have real birders in the room and sometimes we have amateur birders like me.
Is it a type of wren?
It is. This is a Buick's wren. One thing exciting that I need to incorporate into this presentation is that the American Ornithological Society is actually going to be removing human, like people-derived names from birds, which is really cool because there are some animals that are very beloved that are named for people that have had some pretty damaging effects in the world. So it's exciting. So it will not, I don't know Buick, I don't know the namesake of Buick, but a lot of our birds will be given different names now. Bird names for birds, as it's called. What about these guys?
Baby coyotes?
Yep, you got it. This was an exceptionally cute little coyote pack. These pups were born in August of 2020.
So cute.
They were very cute. Yeah, how about this guy? Also cute in a different way, in a powerful way.
Is that a red-tailed hawk?
It's not a red-tailed hawk, but it is a hawk. This is a sharp-shinned hawk, and I have no idea how to tell what it is by the head, but I need to add that note. Okay, cool. There'll be a couple more as we move later on. But thanks. It's good to kind of know. Sometimes we have folks that are super instantaneous on the wildlife ID. So it's just fun to give everybody a chance. So this is just to kind of orient you a little bit to wildlife in our watershed. So the North Clackamas Watersheds Council has basically four-ish sort of sub watersheds that we focus on in our work area. The next couple of slides are going to show some maps of the watersheds. So what we see is everywhere that's tinted green on here are the sub watersheds where we focus our work. There's the Mount Scott Creek and Kellogg Creek system, and River Forest Creek, Boardman Creek, and Rainierson Creek. So all of those creeks flow directly into the Willamette River. And now this these lines are now basically it combined the different colors of our work areas, and it's just all green, and the focus here now is the streams. So this is showing all of the surface streams in the North Clackamas watersheds and in our work area. So really one of the key parts of our watershed for wildlife is what's called the confluence habitat. So confluence is where one river or water body meets another water body. So where each of these creeks flow into the Willamette River, that's sort of a hotspot for wildlife, particularly for watershed councils, since many watershed councils are focused on fish health in the objectives of the work that we do. So let's see, and then I'll actually scooch just backwards one more slide. The tan areas towards the edges here are the cities of Milwaukee and Happy Valley and Gladstone. And this map is helpful, even though it looks really jumbled, to show those jurisdictions because, well, I didn't even define what a watershed is. And so I'll do that really briefly for us. A watershed is just the area of land where the water that falls flows to a common body of water. And often the edges of watersheds are on like ridge tops or mountains, because you can more clearly say on the east side, the water from the mountain flows this way, and on the west side, it flows into this different stream system. And so because the boundaries that we are paying attention to in watershed restoration are dictated by the landscape, it's interesting to look at city overlays as jurisdictions, because it starts to like illustrate to you how complex or like layered and partnered our work is inherently, because we have so many different levels of like government and special districts and land ownerships, right? We always say salmon don't know what county they're swimming in, right? Like they, our coyotes don't know when they're in unincorporated versus incorporated Clackamas County, right? So talking a little bit about just the watershed boundary and its juxtaposition with jurisdictions and other, human determined factors is important for how we work with wildlife. So these photo labels are now kind of showing some of the maybe bigger anchor habitats in the watersheds. Towards the northwestmost corner of our watersheds, we have where Kellogg Creek flows into the Willamette River, and you can see on the screen share here that there's a lake. There's an impoundment behind Kellogg Dam, which is a defunct dam that was built when Abraham Lincoln was still a congressman as a flour mill. Does not serve a purpose any longer, but it has created this kind of backup in the creek system, where now what's called Kellogg Lake is, habitat for like ducks and invasive carp, for instance, but it really should be serving a much bigger function and supporting native fish instead of invasive carp. We have Elk Rock Island, which is a very fun site, and I will say we have a volunteer event there this weekend to tie down Christmas trees into the off channel between the island and the shore for fish habitat. So we'll talk a little bit, you'll see a bit more about fish habitat as we move forward. And then we have spaces like North Clackamas Park, where we have, athletic fields 100 feet away from beaver dams. We have the Three Creeks Natural Area, which, as it sounds like, is where several creeks converge and is a really neat floodplain spot. Up here, I'll call out Scouters Mountain specifically because Eric and I learned that we live in the same neighborhood in Scouters Mountain. But we are both just barely outside of the North Clackamas watersheds, and we're in the Clackamas River Basin watershed. So depending on if you can see the very edges of the top of your screens, you can see these little, the creek systems moving downhill away from the peak of Scouters Mountain. And so on this side, to the east, is where it flows down into Rock Creek and then into the Clackamas River. So I don't want to belabor a map for too long when we have cute wildlife photos to look at, but Boardman Wetlands is a really neat site, Linda, that's a bit closer to you. And
Oh, we go over there pretty often. We call it the duck park.
yeah.
And the nutria, I mean, it's fun. It's a fun place to go.
It is really cool. I was able to go right before they actually officially opened at the height of the pandemic.
Yeah.
But I haven't been since, and I really would like to see how it's looking now.
It's one of our favorite playgrounds for my granddaughter because of the wildlife and the wetlands, as well as playground equipment. So it's,
Yeah.
It's a great place to take kids.
Yeah, those mixed use spaces are so awesome. That's so cool. I'm so glad that you enjoy it. Okay. Some of the tongue-in-cheek things will have been from Neil, our executive director. And again, with appreciation to Steve for the wildlife photos. Okay, so the last couple of slides were just kind of to illustrate the size of the watersheds that we work in, and we've already showed some photos of wildlife. So a couple other neat tidbits. What creature changes the physical environment the most in the world? What living thing?
I would say, well, I want to say beavers, but it's probably humans.
Awesome. So you were ahead of the trick question, because most people know already, since we've shown beaver videos, that beavers are very impactful in a really important way to our environment. But it is humans. Humans, of course, change things the most, right? We have industrialization and thumbs and things like that. But the second most impactful animal in the world as far as changing the physical environment is beaver. And they are really good allies to fish and other native critters around here. One really interesting and neat thing is about the impact that salmon have even outside of the streams that they live in. So salmon are born in freshwater, migrate out and live in the ocean, and they swim back upstream to freshwater to spawn, and they die, and they reproduce and they die. And there's a way to test basically some of the genetic origin of DNA in different like samples from the environment. And so scientists were able to find that about a third of the nitrogen in old growth forests come from salmon, or like is marine in origin, and so therefore comes basically from salmon as they came back upstream to spawn, and their carcasses were maybe carried from the stream side up shore, and then a bear eats a salmon and walks further up through the forest. So the nutrient load that salmon provide to our ecosystems is really substantial. Also, there's 5 major migratory dragonfly species in the United States. There's some in the more of the southeast region, but as far as on the west side of the contiguous US, of the 3 major migratory dragonfly species that we have, all of them are found in the North Clackamas watersheds. And when we say migratory dragonfly, we're talking about a dragonfly that's migrating from Honduras to British Columbia. Maybe not one single dragonfly going that whole extent, but that's the southern and northern end of the ranges that the dragonflies move through. So they can migrate really incredible distances. So who else is here and who else might we find? Neil, our executive director, says he would bet money that no matter where you are, you're about 100 yards away from a great horned owl. And that's just a good reminder that even though we can't see the wildlife that is here all the time, that doesn't mean that they're not near us. So we're going to be focusing a bit more closely tonight on fish, particularly salmon. We're going to be focusing on beavers and talking about coyotes as well. But before we dig into fish and their habitat needs, I wanted to see how many of these birds you guys can identify. This is that come off of mute time. Who do you recognize? And there's no need to be embarrassed if we don't know.
Is the second one a Cooper's hawk?
It is not a Cooper's hawk.
Okay.
I'll give you a hint. It's not a hawk, it's a falcon.
Oh.
Peregrine falcon?
No. And to be fair, peregrine isn't in the common name we hear most about it. So this is an American kestrel. So they are the smallest falcon in North America. They're really well adjusted to like suburban or agricultural landscapes. You often see them perched on the wires looking for prey. But they are cavity nesters. So this, Steve got this photo of a kestrel entering a cavity. They're nicknamed a sparrowhawk because they're small birds of prey, and sparrowhawk is also one of the names of a native plant nursery in the area. So fun tidbit there. All right. What about any of the
third
others?
one a belted kingfisher?
This is, yes, the punk rock hairdo is the belted kingfisher. I like having the great blue heron and the kingfisher not too far away from each other because they look really similar to folks at first glance. But yeah, the belted kingfisher is quite a bit smaller. Those are the ones that we'll see flying kind of close to the water, and they're pretty loud. And a bit unusually, the females are a bit showier and they have a red stripe. Okay, and then left or right side?
Is it a calliope hummingbird?
Ooh, I'm not sure about colloquial other names for calliope hummingbird, but this is an Anna's hummingbird.
Ah,
So Anna's hummingbird is one of the more like common and adaptable hummingbird species, are the ones that do hang out here year round. So these last couple of weeks during the storm, these were the hummingbirds that people were desperately trying to thaw their nectar to keep fed during the ice.
that was me.
Yep. And any guesses for the one on the left? It looks kind of familiar to some people, but
It's definitely a type of woodpecker.
it is. Yeah, it's not any of the three main woodpeckers that we have here. It's not a pileated or a hairy or a downy woodpecker. So this guy on our far left is a red-breasted sapsucker. So when you see holes that are drilled in trees that are kind of all in a row, like side to side to side to side, that's the work of a sapsucker. And cool. Okay, what about non-bird wildlife?
I'm pretty sure top right is a skink of some sort.
Yes, it's a western skink. Well done. That's the one that people are usually stumped on. Okay. And on the upper left, we have a western painted turtle. So the western painted turtle and pond turtles are the two native turtles of concern here. And then we have a swallowtail butterfly on the lower right. Moths have kind of fuzzier, frillier antenna compared to butterflies. That's one way to tell them apart at a glance. And then on the left here, we have one of the major migratory dragonfly species, but I can't remember if it's the common green darner, the variegated meadowhawk, or the black saddlebag. It's one of those. And if my entomologist friend were in the room, they would be able to tell me. Okay, I wish that this video, it like got taken, we need to re-up the connection on this video, but you can just barely see. This is from a trail cam that someone put in their yard, one of our Streamside Stewards program participants. So the kind of joke that we were making in like 2021 was that wildlife learned how to social distance way before we as humans did. Just to say that there's lots of things that go on that we don't see. But because wildlife cameras have become more affordable, and there's other technology as well, like GPS trackers that scientists can use, we can kind of, spy on our wildlife a little bit better and start to learn more about movement patterns in urban areas. This trail cam moment was really neat. It's of a raccoon pulling a pretty good sized fish out of, I want to say this is Kellogg Creek. So there's two raccoons and one big fish that's coming out, and it was neat to receive that video from one of our streamside stewards because they had no idea that this stretch of creek that was in their backyard had fish of this size in it. So for wildlife in urban areas, it's really all about habitat. Animals need spaces that will provide food, water, shelter, and reproduction, right? So they need all four of these things, but possibly at different times or in different life stages, right? So one way that habitat is discussed, and I'll go into this a little bit more later, is we can talk about wildlife or habitat patches. And a patch is a good quality, high quality habitat, but sometimes it doesn't meet all of the needs all of the time. And so when animals need to move around, they might be so lucky as to have a corridor, or they might need to do things like stepping stones and different, which would be smaller patches of habitat as opposed to a contiguous strip. And if neither stepping stones or corridors are available, then there's this lack of connectivity. And of course, for different animals, stepping stone versus corridor habitat looks a little bit different, right? Fish can't fly across the street that, a weasel might be able to dart across or something like that. So promoting habitat connectivity is something that is really important. And the 1995 bond measure in the Green Spaces Natural Plan here helps to kind of create this island sort of biogeography to an urban area where we are creating or protecting spaces for wildlife to have in urban areas. So now to dig into the fish, now we're going to spend a little bit of time on fish and on beaver and on coyotes. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip us over the guessing, but we're going to show a couple different kinds of fish. This is a coho fish, or a coho salmon, excuse me. It is a fish too, but it's a coho salmon. This is a female Chinook salmon. And it's worth noting that these fish will look different when they are spawning versus living out in the ocean. Here we have steelhead. So steelhead and rainbow trout are genetically identical. Their only difference is behavioral. So steelhead are the anadromous version of rainbow trout. Anadromous is the word that describes fish moving out to the ocean and coming back again. So salmon, salmon are born in fresh water and migrate out towards the ocean. And then when they are returning from the ocean, it's a pretty drastic habitat change for them to move from salt water to fresh water. You have cells with like salt water membranes, and all of that stuff needs to change. And so salmon are pretty raggedy by the time they're able to spawn. And they die immediately after. Steelhead can actually spawn multiple times. So it's really cool to talk about steelhead and rainbow trout, meaning offspring of a steelhead could decide to just be rainbow trout and stay in the freshwater, and vice versa. There could be offspring of a rainbow trout that was a resident and it decides to go to the ocean and come back again. So this is a coastal cutthroat trout. Some of our coastal cutthroat trout, despite the name coastal, tend to be resident species. But these guys are around in the watersheds as well. This is one of my favorite fish to talk about. This is Pacific lamprey. So Pacific lamprey are pretty remarkable looking. They're a lot less familiar as far as fish look at a glance to us. So Pacific lamprey are a prehistoric jawless fish. They don't have bones, they instead have a cartilage system. And they have been around for a very long time. So across the top bar here is just kind of a prehistoric timeline. So over on the far right is when humans appeared in the fossil record about 100,000 years ago. Salmon appeared in the fossil record 6 million years ago. Keep moving all the way back. We finally reached the age of the dinosaurs. That's when sturgeon appeared in the fossil record 200 million years ago. Lamprey have been around unchanged in the fossil record for 450 million years. And especially Western scientists and especially Pacific lamprey, we don't know very much about them. Certainly not nearly as much as we know about salmon and their habitat needs. And part of that is because when white folks came to this area, salmon was recognized more immediately as like a quote unquote valuable fish. Whereas lamprey were considered like a trash fish. They are I'm trying to decide which tidbit to talk about first. They're parasitic. So again, instead of having a jaw, they have kind of a sucker shaped arrangement of teeth. So they feed on blood of bigger fish or mammals. And they burrow under the sediment. So they spend the first like 8 years of their life only like an inch or few long as little tiny filter feeders called amicetes. Just barely soaking in on what moves around them. And then they do make their way out to the ocean and back. Whereas salmon return to their natal stream and have like a homing instinct and go back to where they pretty specifically the waterway that they were born in. Lamprey aren't homing in that way, but they are anadromous, so they do migrate out to the ocean and back again. And they're also nocturnal, so they're just harder to study because they're under sediment, active at night, and not really recognized by dominant culture as valuable. This photo is at Willamette Falls and it was taken in 1913. Willamette Falls is one of the last or one of the it's like the most significant place where Native American community members are able to harvest Pacific lamprey. If none of the three of you have been to like a salmon bake or Indigenous Culture Day celebrations, I highly recommend them. It's really fun to try traditionally prepared salmon, and this last October I got to try Pacific lamprey for the first time too. So chances are if it's somewhere in the Portland area, it's the Bruno family that are cooking up the salmon, and I could talk more about that, but one thing I have that can't remember off the top of my head if this is strictly embedded in this presentation or not, but it's something that I talked about in the first presentation is working with Indigenous community members is a really important part of the work that scientists are doing in watershed restoration, in fish protection work, I don't have anything like in particular prepared about to discuss about that, but these landscapes, these watersheds were actively managed for food forests, for healthy regeneration of plants through things like fire, and fish on the landscape are incredibly important. Salmon have declined so substantially. We're at like less than 5% of our historic salmon populations. They're a keystone species. I discussed, nitrogen in forests being associated with salmon, and they have a really big economic impact as well. This was back in 2013, so we just know that the billions of dollars is dramatically increased. As far as economic input in Oregon. This was in Oregon. Okay. And of course, wildlife at different stages need different things. So let's see, only about 1 in 10,000 eggs that are laid become salmon that grow up and reach spawning age. So this photo is a salmon in Upper Mount Scott Creek. They can only sometimes get above Kellogg Dam. In urban areas, a pretty significant recent scientific discovery was isolating the chemical that is responsible for acute coho salmon die-offs in urban areas. It's an additive called 6-PPDQ that's used in car tires. And so as it's used as a preservative and as it leaches out, when we get the first rain and a bunch of that is washed into our waterways, that chemical causes abrupt and acute coho salmon die-offs. And it doesn't seem to affect Chinook salmon in quite the same numbers, but it's posing a pretty big question and the need for change. And it sounds like one of those like ubiquitous or just this problem that sounds impossible to solve. But that's the part where we remind folks like, well, we've dealt with asbestos and lead and things like that were everywhere, but we found better alternatives too. And in the meantime, we can better manage the water that's coming off of our roads. So salmon need complexity. They need those plants along our waterways to filter that runoff, especially in urban areas. So here we see the, deep pools for hiding and for colder water to, stay nice and chilly at the bottom there. We don't have a lot of like culverts or physical barriers. We might have some beaver activity here, but beaver dams do work for salmon. This is a photo from the rapid bioassessment that the Watersheds Council did a couple of years ago. So this is what the creeks in our area might look a bit more typically like. So we're asking questions like, is there enough shade? So in the background, you see there's like lawn going all the way to the edge of the creek. What kind of substrate is on the bottom? Can fish lay eggs in it? What's the temperature? All of this kind of information and ranking the complexity of our different stream systems are part of what the Watershed Council is doing to get an idea of what to improve habitat-wise. For the most part, as I mentioned, those confluence areas are really the most significant parts of our watersheds, but we're working to open up access for fish where the watersheds are healthy upstream. That key one being Kellogg Dam. But this is what a lot of the fish might look like in the North Clackamas watersheds. Beaver are our watershed rock stars. They are called ecosystem engineers. Their dams create floodplains, which are really valuable for a whole host of reasons, including benefiting salmon habitat and water quality. Beavers can be known as a nuisance, and there's a couple things that we, can recommend folks to do when beaver are causing a problem. But generally, if like your house is flooding, it's probably because your house is built in the floodplain, right? It isn't the beaver that are the problem. And one thing related to stormwater filtration, I'll just scooch us through over to that slide. Here's a really cute quick video of baby beavers, that clutch of beavers. It was their first time swimming in Jennings Lodge. And we just wanted you to get to see the cute video. I'm gonna let that play just a little. All right, little babies. I can link this to you if you want to watch it in full, but towards the end, the mom comes and gives them a push around. Anyway, so beaver, change habitat in a really important and significant way. This is of a beaver dam along Kellogg Creek that got washed out kind of with the year, but just even having temporary beaver dams as opposed to year-round ones provides adds habitat complexity. And I mentioned that dams work for salmon, and the question that often it comes up is, well, doesn't the dam block fish access? And there's a couple of different reasons why that's not like a concern for ecologists as far as beaver and salmon working together. Part of it is the time of year when salmon are migrating are when beaver dams are more likely to be washed out, or the water levels aren't going to be as low for them. Also, the dams, they, by placing, you know, rocks, or excuse me, by placing woody debris across the stream, it creates that floodplain. It creates that sort of slow backup of water. And I mentioned that this was an issue with Kellogg Dam, right? And Kellogg Lake. And that Kellogg Lake just like supports invasive trout, and that it gets really warm and things like that. Well, beaver dams allow for filtration to happen underwater. So what we have, if you've ever jumped into a swimming pool or a lake, the deeper you go, the colder it gets, right? So beaver dams actually help to reduce stream temperatures and allow for that slower filtration of cooler water under the surface. So a human dam versus a beaver dam, very different consequences basically on the landscape. And this was a really neat study that was just from a couple of years ago here in the Portland area. There was a stormwater treatment facility that was built. I think was in the Columbia Slough watershed, so kind of northeast Portland. And it was just this filtration system. So water from around the city was directed to move through this vegetated facility in order to like capture pollutants and things like that. And then beaver moved in right after not too long after the project was completed. And so there were, you know, folks in the local government and engineers that had, you know, they just spent millions of dollars building this facility, and it was, you know, removing its pollutants, and beaver came and changed everything. So those folks were kind of freaking out. Well, there's a water quality scientist at the city of Gresham called Katie Holzer, and she said, well, wait, let's collect some data. So they collected data at the up and downstream part of the stormwater facility where it wasn't affected by beaver. And they also collected the same data up and downstream of the beaver dams. And here's the outcome. Beaver dams were doing better than the multi-million-dollar stormwater facility. Yeah, so the beavers got to stay because they were doing a better job than the designed facility itself. And the water was also coming out. This chart doesn't show, but the temperature was also coming out colder than it was going in. Again, that thing that I just mentioned about like the depth. And temperature is considered a pollutant for water quality management. One other neat thing related to beavers, this is a bit more relevant outside of urban areas, but Evergreen, your hand is up.
Yeah, I was just curious, how exactly are the dams removing these pollutants? Like, where are the pollutants going with the dam being there?
My understanding is that it's really kind of like getting filtered in the sediment and any plant material that it's moving through. So I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know, for instance, I could ask Katie Holzer this question and follow up with you too. Like where exactly the water measurements were taken up and downstream. My guess is they weren't measuring like 2 feet up and 2 feet downstream of the dam, but probably a longer distance. And so that space between the upstream input area and the dam itself, that water has been slowed down, and there's vegetation along the sides of the banks, and especially if it's a floodplain area. So there's also just the living plants that the beaver dams help to provide a slower process through.
Gotcha. That's awesome.
I say that with again, I should send an email to Katie to clarify and see if that's correct, or if there's something more to it than that. Meaning I don't think that I'm like flat out wrong, but I'm not saying that I've painted the full picture.
I was gonna say, that sounds correct.
Yeah, so don't quote me on it, but consider it an educated guess. This little video is actually someone's entire PhD thesis put into a stop motion. It's a little, the learnings are a bit more applicable outside of the metro area. And when I say it was put into, when I say it was someone's thesis put into stop motion, it's the doctor that did the research who put this together. So it wasn't a infantilizing way. I hope you can hear the music because it's really cute. Okay, so basically what Dr. Emily Fairfax found is that beaver are nature's firefighters. The way that their dams back up and slow down water help to mitigate the effects of catastrophic wildfire on the landscape. Because vegetation is more saturated and the landscape is wetter, it reduces fire's impact. Which fire on the landscape, first of all, should not be considered a solely bad thing. In fact, the reason why we say catastrophic wildfires and why catastrophic wildfires are kind of a thing as opposed to just wildfires is because in the last couple of 100 years, there's been a fear of fire and a suppression of fire on the landscape. We need fire to move through our landscapes. There's some plants that regenerate after fire moves through. And by not allowing the fire to come through, our forests get kind of clogged up with a lot of plant material. And then especially when you have invasive plants in a forested area as well, they contribute to what's called ladder fuels, or just fuel, where there's more flammable material in this space. So invasive plants, because they're able to take over and kind of outcompete native species, they're also going to be just denser foliage. And we have invasive trees that kind of provide a chance for fire to move from the ground up into the canopies. So long and short of it is indigenous cultural fire practices are really awesome, and beavers are also really awesome regarding fire. And this is what we talked about beavers as a keystone species. And this is more footage from Steve Berliner, and it's just kind of a bit of a day or so in activity at the same beaver dam. So this photo is all at a beaver dam. So we see a muskrat, and then we see a mink moving through. And there's the mink again. There's the mink in the daytime. This is all at one beaver dam. You can see the perspective doesn't change. We see a coyote move through. Oops. We have raccoons. And then the star of the show, the architect himself. So beaver dams are, this video is really good evidence showing that they're really kind of a magnet. They institute a change in the water flow, which allows again for that water to get cooler. The logs, decompose over time, and with decomposition comes bugs, which brings in more critters. This was along Boardman Creek in Jennings Lodge. Okay, so this is an example of a beaver analog structure where folks basically set something up for the beavers to try. They were trying to encourage beaver activity. And if I am remembering the context of what happened here, The beavers built a dam in a totally different place instead, and it did a great job. So it's neat to think of beavers as eco partners because they create floodplains, which are important for water absorption, and help to like reduce the severity and frequency of floods, especially in urban areas. So beavers are kind of a supplement to a lot of the work that we do, and they can do it better and cheaper and faster. Okay, on to coyotes. Coyotes fall under that label of charismatic megafauna, meaning they are big, we can see them, and they are, especially the babies on the left, cute. There's a lot of press around urban coyotes. It kind of ebbs and flows, but another member of our wildlife community that was social distancing before it was cool, coyotes are all over the landscape, way more than I think most of us expect. In Chicago, there was some really cool research coming out of the University of Chicago, where they were able to tag some coyotes and found that they were moving through downtown Chicago on a daily basis. And coyotes are opportunistic omnivores. So the main thing that makes up their diet is rodents. So think like rats and squirrels and stuff, but also birds and insects. And they are an urban apex predator. So they I want to make sure like my thoughts are in order. I'm distracted because my throat's getting dry. As an urban apex predator, so it's sort of similar to like the great horned owl. There's probably one near us, we just don't know it. I saw a coyote out my front window a couple of weeks ago. For the first time, I've only lived here for less than a year. And I was just on the phone with someone chatting and happened to be gazing out the window after dark and saw a coyote move through my yard. And if I had been in the, I could have so easily missed it. So coyotes they are around, and they're, providing us the kind of low-key pest control. And coyotes are also some smaller than I think people think they are. My dog is a husky mix, and the coyote was looked to be about the same size but a bit smaller than her. So this is the first time I've looked at this chart since seeing the coyote along the same fence that I see my dog walking, and it seems about right. Their average weight is only about 30 or 35 pounds in the Portland area though. And this is a photo of a coyote on one of the MAX trains several years ago. So we know that coyotes are here in our urban areas. And this kind of leads us into, threats and solutions. So this particular owl was in one of our board members' houses, and it hit its head on the window, and it stayed there for 3 days. And really that kind of just leads us into this piece about like there are things that we ought to try to manage for so that we can have a peaceful coexistence with wildlife as much as possible. And Portland's history is Stumptown. You can see the namesake here. It was called that because the quicker way to move around was to jump from stump to stump when it got really rainy after people came in and cut all of the trees. So what are the things that have been, this is the sort of kind of a list of the things that have affected wildlife. We have vegetation and habitat loss, vegetation removal and habitat loss, which has limited those moving patterns for connectivity, right? We've channelized our streams or piped them entirely. So in downtown Portland and a lot of inner southeast Portland, the creeks are still existing in pipes underground. This is an example from Johnson Creek, the construction of the WPA well in the 1930s, which unfortunately this project exacerbated the flooding problem because straightening it out and lining it with rock did not do what we thought it would, because it removed the complexity that we need for water to be able to soak into the banks of our streams. As we've removed trees, we lose a lot of associated benefits that trees provide to our ecosystems. So a tree along a creek is really important for several reasons. One of those that we can talk about is just erosion, that tree roots hold the soil together compared to invasive plants like, for instance, English ivy or kind of neutral ornamental plants like grass. Those have pretty shallow root systems, but when you have trees and shrubs of native plant species, you're not just getting diversity above ground, but you're also getting root diversity. So the tree's ability to hold soil together along streams is really important. And then you have the fact that trees along the creek are providing shade, and salmon and other, other fish and wildlife that we've talked about today are cold water fish species. They need cold temperatures. And so when we lose the shade along streams, our waters get warmer. And that's directly tied as well to oxygen levels. Colder water holds more dissolved oxygen. So when our water temperatures start to get warm, it's not just that it's physically warmth, like physically uncomfortable warmth, but it limits the oxygen that the water can hold in a way that prevents salmon from being able to exist in a stream in a healthy way. So habitat fragmentation, again, this is another visualization of sort of these core areas or patches and the ways that we can have corridors or stepping stones for wildlife. And this is what part of our watersheds look like for wildlife. This is the 99 East Corridor. So this, highway built when FDR was our president goes across all of the creeks in the North Clackamas watersheds. And it's scary sometimes to drive and make an unprotected left turn on that street, much less to try and, as Neil put it in one of our earlier presentations, be a frog playing Frogger here, right? There are some really physical barriers to habitat connectivity in our watersheds. This is Kellogg Dam, the big barrier that the Watersheds Council is working to remove. There's only, the fish ladder only works as a slip and slide for otters. It does not work for fish. Except for a couple of times a year when water levels are high enough for the fish to just move straight up. This is what a lot of fish passage barriers or habitat barriers look like. It's just where our roads cross over our creeks. And so we've built culverts, which are these tubes that we send pipes, or these tubes or pipes that we send our creeks through. And they're just, most of them have not been well designed with fish passage in mind, and so have created barriers. And then there's kind of innocently created barriers like kids playing in the creek. This was the photo from the rapid bioassessment where it was, there was a family that lived along the creek and they created a little dam for their kids to get to play in the creek during the summertime. And that's fine. Like, please, yes, we need more kids in nature, but like knock that down at the end, right? So just those kinds of considerations that we don't always have at the forefront of our minds. This is a really big example of an awesome way to restore habitat connectivity. I think this is maybe up in Canada and is designed for like elk and grizzly bears. These types of restoring connectivity and these projects can get really, really large. For us, it's more likely to look like something like this. So this is on Upper Johnson Creek, where we can replace an old culvert that was, small and about this size with a much larger one that's more below the surface of the ground, and so provides for a more natural substrate for the creek to move across. And also, just as we as our urban areas expand, the way that we think about design for people and for wildlife, or as we think about designing spaces, right, they can help wildlife or they can not. So these are two examples in the area of riverside trails or greenways, right? This is Tom McCall Waterfront Park and along the Tualatin River. And this, Tom McCall, it's great for people, but pretty challenging for wildlife. It's pavement until you hit the seawall. And Neil is a avid kayaker, and he's seen mink running along the seawall and then ducking into pipes, like little mountain goats, and then ducking into pipes. This Tualatin River plan, you can see it has a lot more space for wildlife as well as for people. So just as we learn more, there's different ways of doing things. And these types of, when we think about habitat and ways to improve habitat, it's a matter of scale, just like watersheds are a matter of how zoomed in or zoomed out you're focusing. But you can have, oh, I was mixing up a couple of slides, but just to know that we can look at, Portland to Beaverton or Milwaukee to Happy Valley. We can look at passage in that way, or we can zoom in. And for the rest of you, Eric and I discovered we live in the same neighborhood. We could think from his house to mine. What's the habitat corridor there? So I find remembering scale as an important thing to be a reassuring like consideration when problems feel really big and overwhelming, right? Because an aside that I think I might have built later into the presentation, but I want to be sure to say now, just for the sake of time, is a lot of us might know how monarch butterflies rely on milkweed. So it's the one plant, like monarch butterflies, their entire life cycle depends on milkweed, this one specific kind of plant, right? So if you don't have milkweed, you're not going to have monarch butterflies. So what are people doing to support monarch butterflies? Planting milkweed all over the place as much as possible. Well, it turns out that 99% of insects are specialists, just like monarch butterflies are to milkweed. So that relationship, that kind of really tight ratio, one critter, one plant, most insects have a really tight relationship with one or a few native plants that they co-evolved with. And then when you cycle that up and you think about birds, 9 out of 10 terrestrial birds, so like as opposed to puffins or pelicans, but land living birds, 9 out of 10 of them, regardless of what those birds eat in their adulthood, feed their young on insects. So whether those birds are going to grow up to eat, seeds or berries or insects or smaller birds or whatever it may be, they're feeding their young on insects because they're really high in protein and water. And so knowing that our birds rely on our insects, and our insects really rely on plants and our native plants specifically, right? So when we're thinking about scale, having a 10 by 10 patch of lawn versus replacing or planting some native plants in amidst that lawn makes a really significant difference for providing habitat for wildlife. So yeah, I wanted to kind of pull that up now because I'm talking about kind of the value of thinking of things on a small scale basis. And that's part of why I really love the backyard habitat certification program as something to share and discuss for folks. It's a really great way to have someone come out to your property and give you advice on what to do, and what plants might work well and things like that, as well as it gets you coupons to local businesses and things like that. So the backyard habitat certification program, it's neat to see their mapping and see just how many small little stepping stones there are across the whole Portland metro area as people have worked to add native plants to their yard. Okay. Habitat connectivity for fish. That last slide was a little bit more focused terrestrially, but as I've discussed, right, salmon are anadromous. And so they're born in freshwater creeks, mature in the ocean, and then come back up to spawn. And so when you think of habitat, you have wherever they're spawning, and you have the ocean, and then whatever is in between. So this is zoomed in a little bit. So the Columbia River here at the top is what flows directly out into the ocean at the Oregon coast. But right here we have the Willamette River. And there's a pretty good corridor of habitat between the Columbia River and the Pacific Ocean. And there's good spawning habitat. We'll focus here on the upper Clackamas River. We could also focus in the Tualatin River or beyond. But what we have is this stretch of the Willamette River in the Portland area that is just geologically kind of straight and simple. There isn't a lot of this complexity along the side for fish to stop and rest. So there's this whole stretch where stepping stone habitat is needed. And it just so happens that where smaller creeks flow into the Willamette River, those confluences are really high value habitat. Up until a couple of years ago, there was there's been a change in recent years to limit boating that puts a wake on the water, like makes it really kind of turbulent. And part of that reasoning is migrating fish are getting totally kind of whipped around and battered. And the Willamette River is just generally a strong, large river. So when you're a little tiny fish migrating out to the ocean, or you're an exhausted, dying salmon trying to make your way up to your stream to lay your eggs and die, those areas off the main channel, those confluences off of this really straight part of the Willamette River are really valuable. And it happens that there's Johnson Creek and Tryon Creek, and then Kellogg and Mount Scott and River Forest and Boardman and Rainierson Creek. So some of the North Clackamas Watersheds creeks are helping to fill that role. Let's see. And what does that actually look like? It looks, oh, there's our watersheds again. This is the map that we looked at earlier. Providing those stepping stones through this reach of the river allows access to multiple corridors, right? We could be zooming and looking all the way up at the upper Willamette River down in Southern Oregon as salmon habitat. But this is what those confluence areas look like. So this is at the mouth of where Boardman Creek flows into the Willamette River. So there's some spawning habitat here. This is kind of the mouth of the creek at the river, and there could be some improvements if we think of that healthy habitat photo I've shown. Adding log jams and more tree cover and things like that are the types of projects that the North Clackamas Watersheds Council is pursuing and raising money for. Really creating overall more complex rearing habitat for salmon. In the Kellogg Mount Scott watershed, this is a habitat assessment for potential fish distribution. So we know that if we can just remove the dam and have a better habitat right here where Kellogg Lake currently is, that we can welcome in a lot of fish. This is Kellogg Dam again, another angle to it. As far as terrestrial wildlife habitat goes, we've talked about crossings, connections, and stepping stones. Here in the Portland area, a lot of habitat connectivity is along our waterways. And it's kind of interesting. Neil is from the Bay Area originally, and he has observed that in the Bay Area, a lot of the habitat connectivity and corridors are on the ridge tops where things are a bit less developed. So also San Francisco is very hilly and different geographically, but just an interesting kind of contrast. So right here, we can see blue dots are patches. Those solid green lines are corridors, and then the dotted lines might be more like stepping stones. So these are not a random assortment of dots and lines. These are on the North Clackamas watersheds and a little bit beyond. So I've put patches on things like Mount Talbert or different natural areas on the south side of the Clackamas River, at Elk Rock Island, Boardman wetlands, things like that are all sort of called out. And you can see this is along Kellogg Creek, for instance. You can sort of see where the connectivity might be. And this is that piece that I wanted to talk about earlier, but the size of the scale can matter. So even just having some potted native plants can be helpful for local pollinators. And when we go from, small gardens towards more public facing types of habitat, of course, the scale of habitat impact is increased. And so to do the things like planning and cost and complexity, right? So knowing where we have the habitat that we want to promote and protect is really important. So white-breasted nuthatches are dependent on oak woodland habitat, and oak, most of this area used to be oak savanna habitat before we developed it, right? The hills were left kind of Douglas firry, but the flat areas were oak were developed first. So, oaks grow more slowly and often get converted to a Douglas fir forest because we don't have the fire patterns of years past that oaks are more resilient to. So it's this complicated kind of ecosystem for us to protect, but you can see that this overlay of where oak is throughout the North Clackamas Watersheds area here, this matters for a white-breasted nuthatch. This is their habitat. So sorry for the folks along Thiessen Road and Johnson Road here, but the folks near Mount Talbot might see a white-breasted nuthatch, much more likely. Okay, this is the transition piece to how often support or how we can support wildlife. And I know that we're getting close to 7:30 and I want to have a bit of time for Q&As. So I'm going to speed us through. And Eric, I think you might have needed to hop off early. I can't see my participants right now because Zoom is being weird, but no worries if you have to hop off. One thing I will say, if you do have to hop off and if you're still on, is the Clackamas Community College's Environmental Learning Center is putting on a weekly wildlife and water friendly gardens series each Thursday at noon for the next, I want to say 6 weeks, starting this Thursday. So if you want more information on that, let me know. And all of these, this is for everyone, of course, to know too, that there's going to be a lot of really great kind of deeper dives into specific topics. Okay. That's just kind of an immediate available resource. So how to support wildlife as individuals. This is one of my favorite memes turned education tool, which is saying, why does your yard still look like this? We don't dress like this anymore. There's some pretty strong opinions about people that are like anti-grass or anti-lawns. And really, this kind of layout is something that would never really work for wildlife in North America, but we've inherited this aesthetic of a bright green lawn. And, these lawns can depend on herbicides that run off into our waterways and provide some habitat, but again, really not as much as when we have just maybe some little native shrubs here instead of just these little green round guys. And natural areas are a bit more messy looking, but there's an absolute middle ground of landscaping with native plants that can still kind of tend to this more tidy aesthetic, especially for folks in HOAs, for instance. But there's a lot that we can do to better support wildlife on our manicured areas. Implementing solutions that allow for creekside planting instead of armoring stream banks makes a big difference. I've mentioned the backyard habitat certification program. Providing spaces for wildlife to get in and out of your yard is good. Knowing that wood is good, especially relevant post-storm, but dead wood is a really valuable part of the habitat. So when people have trees that are maybe it has split its main branch, so the top is kind of structurally unsound, rather than removing an entire tree, there's a really great thing that's happening more often where people will just leave the standing dead wood as a snag, as a habitat tree. And you can even get signs that say like this dead tree is habitat. We don't like getting bit by mosquitoes. Bats eat loads of mosquitoes, and standing dead trees are one of the best types of bat habitats that we have around. Getting engaged and learning more, that ties into the wildlife and water friendly garden series, which I just mentioned. But any guesses how many bee species we have in Oregon? 5, 15, 50, or 5?
I believe it's over 500, right?
You must know this already. Yeah, most of the time people guess 15 or 50. I think it's actually maybe even over 600 now. So
And that's what I was thinking. I thought it was.
Yeah, when I put this together, it hadn't gotten there yet, so I'll update it. Yeah, a lot of folks, we know honeybees, we know European honeybees, and that's the one, we don't necessarily know and aren't necessarily exposed to just how much diversity there is in our insects and other, native wildlife. Leaving the leaves is a really good thing. They're free mulch and nutrients and really an overwintering place. This is a chrysalis. I can't remember what critter it is. But that's designed just to look like a leaf. So we have a lot of insects that depend on leaf litter. And really for our native bees, just leaving some bare and undisturbed soil for them to nest in underground is really valuable. Rather than tossing all of our garden clippings, keeping them around, maybe just have a little like brush pile is something that can be really good for a lot of bees that nest in cavities, like in dead stems. Knowing to avoid products with neonicotinoids is really important, especially for any of us that like buy plants from like Home Depot or Fred Meyer. Neonicotinoids basically disorient bugs so they can't find their way back home. And when I talk about solitary ground nesters, I was sitting on the ground working on like a bunch of these little seedlings of a plant that I didn't want to have. And this bee came and went over the course of like 15 minutes, like several times. The same bee came and left from its one little hole. So the neonicotinoids they'll lose their sense of direction. In Europe, they're the leading cause of colony collapse disorder for honeybees. Providing a variety of flower shapes and colors and different times of blooming over the year. This is from a soil and water conservation district near us. Is really helpful. Thinking in canopy layers when we plant is helpful because there's some critters that are up high and some that stay down low. A lot of insects do what's called puddling, where they soak up and get nutrients and minerals from like muddy water. So laying out a little dish with something in it so that they don't drown is helpful. This was why I ran through those statistics earlier about birds, about insects being specialists and that effect on birds. Is we've lost, I want to say it's millions of birds in the last several decades. And the Smithsonian was able to basically link the decline in backyard birds to the presence of non-native plants. So not strictly invasive plants, but just the fact that we have so much lawn in our country when we could be providing habitat has really made a big difference. And then making sure that the plants that we do have are native plants is a really much more solid way to support our wildlife. There we go. I got the 9/10 mixed up. I haven't talked about cats too much, but they might have been on your mind when I was talking about coyotes. Could be an even better reason to invest in a catio. Cats are the leading source of why birds are brought into the care center at Audubon. And they are rarer in that they don't only kill or hunt for food, but for fun as well, basically. I've talked about dead trees as the apartment complexes and cafeterias of our watersheds. I have kind of discussed this with each of you with Evergreen with the others, sorry, so I'm going to scooch through a bit faster about reducing our own kind of pollutant load. Things like rain gardens, volunteering. Johnson Creek has community science surveys. We're going to be doing egg mass surveys in a couple of months. We have our Christmas tree toss coming up this Saturday, which is that photo on the right-hand side. We're engaged in kind of science and planning and policy work, removing Kellogg Dam, implementing improvements to these confluence areas. And then at a planning level, things like low impact development can make a big difference for protecting green spaces and keeping our humans healthy as well, which I will use as a segue into the fact that tomorrow's presentation is going to talk about people in place here in these watersheds. When we fix problems for wildlife, we often fix problems for us too. Or when we implement solutions that improve habitat, they're often beneficial to people as well, whether or not they're overtly meant to. But it's like why we have trails near our creeks, and Boardman Wetlands is a great example. of like the dual benefits. It's not just a park, it's flood control for the neighborhood as well, because it's a floodplain in a wetland area. So with that somewhat rushed end, I think the one closing thought, so when we did when that improvement project happened at the Rainier-Sim confluence, there were 500 juvenile Chinook salmon. So like wildlife are here, they're ready for us, they're ready for our help. And I think bald eagles are a really great comeback story. They were, on the precipice of a really steep decline in extinction. And then this photo was taken from our office in Milwaukee of 2 bald eagles in a tree. So we know that they are near here and that we can help them. And that's my somewhat hasty conclusion, but hopefully on time for Q&A with you too. Thank you guys. I'm going to go ahead. I'll stop the recording, I think.